Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of hashtag Accelerate, Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, and it was written by two people, Alex Williams and Nick. I am honestly not sure how to pronounce this, Srnicek. So I don't often do requests on the channel as far as audiobooks. Sometimes I will work them in if they make sense. This is one such request. I have not read this work before, and I told the person at first glance it didn't exactly look like something I would want to cover, but hey, it's something different. Let's check it out. So this is from 2013, and it's published online at a university website. I couldn't actually find any background information on Alex Williams, but on Nick Srnicek, really I'm hesitant even to venture a guess at the pronunciation, but he is, according to his Wikipedia, born 1982, a Canadian writer and academic, lecturer in digital economy at the Department of Digital Humanities, King's College, London, associated with the political theory of accelerationism and a post-scarcity economy. So, accelerationism, what is it? I've always been told, and I haven't bothered to look into it that much, really. I've always been told that it was an ultra-left ideology and not really worth pursuing. Anyway, I have not read this before. Let's get into the audiobook. We will read it together. It's about a 6-page PDF, and then I'll lead with some comments, and then we can continue the discussion in the comments. So, hashtag Accelerate, Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics. Section 1, Introduction, on the Conjuncture. 1. At the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, global civilization faces a new breed of cataclysm. These coming apocalypses ridicule the norms and organizational structures of the politics which were forged in the birth of the nation-state, the rise of capitalism, and a 20th century of unprecedented wars. 2. Most significant is the breakdown of the planetary climatic system. In time, this threatens the continued existence of the present global human population. Though this is the most critical of the threats which face humanity, a series of lesser but potentially equally destabilizing problems exist alongside and intersect with it. Terminal resource depletion, especially in water and energy reserves, offers the prospect of mass starvation, collapsing economic paradigms, and new hot and cold wars. Continued financial crisis has led governments to embrace the paralyzing death spiral policies of austerity, privatization of social welfare services, mass unemployment, and stagnating wages. Increasing automation in production processes, including, quote, intellectual labor, is evidence of the secular crisis of capitalism, soon to render it incapable of maintaining current standards of living for even the former middle classes of the global north. 3. In contrast to these ever-accelerating catastrophes, today's politics is beset by an inability to generate the new ideas and modes of organization necessary to transform our societies to confront and resolve the coming annihilations. While crisis gathers force and speed, politics withers and retreats. In this paralysis of the political imaginary, the future has been canceled. 4. Since 1979, the hegemonic global political ideology has been neoliberalism, found in some variant throughout the leading economic powers. In spite of the deep structural challenges the new global problems present to it, most immediately the credit, financial, and fiscal crises since 2007 and 8, neoliberal programs have only evolved in the sense of deepening. This continuation of the neoliberal project, or neoliberalism 2.0, has begun to apply another round of structural adjustments, most significantly in the form of encouraging new and aggressive incursions by the private sector into what remains of social democratic institutions and services. This is in spite of the immediately negative economic and social effects of such policies and the longer-term fundamental barriers posed by the new global crises. 5. That the forces of right-wing governmental, non-governmental, and corporate power have been able to press forth with neoliberalization is, at least in part, a result of the continued paralysis and ineffectual nature of much of what remains of the left. 30 years of neoliberalism have rendered most left-leaning political parties bereft of radical thought, hollowed out, and without a popular mandate. At best, they have responded to our present crises with calls for a return to a Keynesian economics, in spite of the evidence that the very conditions which enabled post-war social democracy to occur no longer exist. Comment from S4A, couldn't agree more that we are not going back to social democracy. Specifically because we got social democracy because of the threat of socialism. That no longer exists. If we were getting social democracy, we probably would have it by now. That's not to say all is lost by any means, or that revolutionary insurrection is necessarily the only hope at this point. This is a very interesting document so far. I already have some comments. But anyway, let's get back to the document. We cannot return to mass industrial Fordist labor by fiat, if at all. Even the neo-socialist regimes of South America's Bolivarian Revolution, whilst heartening in their ability to resist the dogmas of contemporary capitalism, remain disappointingly unable to advance an alternative beyond mid-20th century socialism. Organized labor, being systematically weakened by the changes wrought in the neoliberal project, is sclerotic at an institutional level and, at best, capable only of mildly mitigating the new structural adjustments. But with no systematic approach to building a new economy, or the structural solidarity to push such changes through, for now, labor remains relatively impotent. The new social movements which emerged since the end of the Cold War, experiencing a resurgence in the years after 2008, have been similarly unable to devise a new political ideological vision. Instead, they expend considerable energy on internal direct democratic process and affective self-valorization over strategic efficacy, and frequently propound a variant of neo-primitivist localism, as if to oppose the abstract violence of globalized capital with the flimsy and ephemeral, quote, authenticity of communal immediacy. 6. In the absence of a radically new social, political, organizational, and economic vision, the hegemonic powers of the right will continue to be able to push forward their narrow-minded imaginary in the face of any and all evidence. At best, the left may be able for a time to partially resist some of the worst incursions, but this is to be canute against an ultimately irresistible tide. To generate a new left global hegemony entails a recovery of lost possible futures, and indeed the recovery of the future as such. Section 2, Interregnum, on Accelerationisms. 1. If any system has been associated with ideas of acceleration, it is capitalism. The essential metabolism of capitalism demands economic growth, with competition between individual capitalist entities, setting in motion increasing technological developments in an attempt to achieve competitive advantage, all accompanied by increasing social dislocation. In its neoliberal form, its ideological self-presentation is one of liberating the forces of creative destruction, setting free ever-accelerating technological and social innovations. 2. The philosopher Nick Land captured this the most acutely, with a myopic yet hypnotizing belief that capitalist speed alone could generate a global transition towards unparalleled technological singularity. In this visioning of capital, the human can eventually be discarded as mere drag to an abstract planetary intelligence rapidly constructing itself from the bricolaged fragments of former civilizations. However, Landian neoliberalism confuses speed with acceleration. We may be moving fast, but only within a strictly defined set of capitalist parameters that themselves never waver. We experience only the increasing speed of a local horizon, a simple brain-dead onrush rather than an acceleration which is also navigational, an experimental process of discovery within a universal space of possibility. It is the latter mode of acceleration which we hold as essential. 3. Even worse, as Deleuze and Guattari recognized, from the very beginning, what capitalist speed deterritorializes with one hand, it reterritorializes with the other. Progress becomes constrained within a framework of surplus value, a reserve army of labor, and free-floating capital. Modernity is reduced to statistical measures of economic growth, and social innovation becomes encrusted with kitsch remainders from our communal past. Thatcherite Reaganite deregulation sits comfortably alongside Victorian back-to-basics family and religious values. 4. A deeper tension within neoliberalism is in terms of its self-image as the vehicle of modernity, as literally synonymous with modernization, whilst promoting a future that it is constitutively incapable of providing. Indeed, as neoliberalism has progressed, rather than enabling individual creativity, it has tended towards eliminating cognitive inventiveness in favor of an affective production line of scripted interactions coupled to global supply chains and a neo-Fordist Eastern production zone. A vanishingly small cognitariat of elite intellectual workers shrinks with each passing year, and increasingly so as algorithmic automation winds its way through the spheres of affective and intellectual labor. Neoliberalism, though positing itself as a necessary historical development, was in fact a merely contingent means to ward off the crisis of value that emerged in the 1970s. Inevitably, this was a sublimation of the crisis rather than its ultimate overcoming. 5. It is Marx, along with Land, who remains the paradigmatic accelerationist thinker. Contrary to the all-too-familiar critique and even the behavior of some contemporary Marxians, we must remember that Marx himself used the most advanced theoretical tools and empirical data available in an attempt to fully understand and transform his world. He was not a thinker who resisted modernity, but rather one who sought to analyze and intervene within it, understanding that for all its exploitation and corruption, capitalism remained the most advanced economic system to date. Its gains were not to be reversed, but accelerated beyond the constraints of the capitalist value form. 6. Indeed, as even Lenin wrote in the 1918 text, Left-Wing Childishness, quote, "Socialism is inconceivable without large-scale capitalist engineering based on the latest discoveries of modern science. It is inconceivable without planned state organization, which keeps tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of a unified standard in production and distribution. We Marxists have always spoken of this, and it is not worthwhile wasting 2 seconds talking to people who do not understand even this, parentheses, anarchists, and a good half of the left socialist revolutionaries," unquote. 7. As Marx was aware, capitalism cannot be identified as the agent of true acceleration. Similarly, the assessment of left politics as antithetical to technosocial acceleration is also, at least in part, a severe misrepresentation. Indeed, if the political left is to have a future, it must be one in which it maximally embraces this suppressed accelerationist tendency. Section 3. Manifest on the future. 1. We believe that the most important division in today's left is between those that hold to a folk politics of localism, direct action, and relentless horizontalism, and those that outline what must become called an accelerationist politics at ease with a modernity of abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology. The former remains content with establishing small and temporary spaces of non-capitalist social relations, eschewing the real problems entailed in facing foes which are intrinsically non-local, abstract, and rooted deep in our everyday infrastructure. The failure of such politics has been built in from the very beginning. By contrast, an accelerationist politics seeks to preserve the gains of late capitalism while going further than its value system, governance structures, and mass pathologies will allow. 2. All of us want to work less. It is an intriguing question as to why it was that the world's leading economist of the post-war era believed that an enlightened capitalism inevitably progressed toward a radical reduction of working hours. In The Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren, written in 1930, Keynes forecast a capitalist future where individuals would have their work reduced to 3 hours a day. What has instead occurred is the progressive elimination of the work-life distinction, with work coming to permeate every aspect of the emerging social factory. 3. Capitalism has begun to constrain the productive forces of technology, or at least direct them towards needlessly narrow ends. Patent wars and idea monopolization are contemporary phenomena that point to both capital's need to move beyond competition and capital's increasingly retrograde approach to technology. The properly accelerative gains of neoliberalism have not led to less work or less stress, and rather than a world of space travel, future shock, and revolutionary technological potential, we exist in a time where the only thing which develops is marginally better than consumer gadgetry. Relentless iterations of the same basic product sustain marginal consumer demand at the expense of human acceleration. 4. We do not want to return to Fordism. There can be no return to Fordism. The capitalist, quote, golden era was premised on the production paradigm of the orderly factory environment where, parentheses, male workers received security and a basic standard of living in return for a lifetime of stultifying boredom and social repression. Such a system relied upon an international hierarchy of colonies, empires, and an underdeveloped periphery, a national hierarchy of racism and sexism, and a rigid family hierarchy of female subjugation. Let me read that again, because a lot of this applies to things that I see now people pushing for in the, quote, communist left, not left comms, but, communists in the U.S. 4. We do not want to return to Fordism. There can be no return to Fordism. The capitalist, quote, golden era was premised on the production paradigm of the orderly factory environment where, parentheses, male workers received security and a basic standard of living in return for a lifetime of stultifying boredom and social repression. Such a system relied upon an international hierarchy of colonies, empires, and an underdeveloped periphery, a national hierarchy of racism and sexism, and a rigid family hierarchy of female subjugation. For all the nostalgia many may feel, this means you, this regime is both undesirable and practically impossible to return to. Okay, comment mode off. 5. Accelerationists want to unleash latent productive forces. In this project, the material platform of neoliberalism does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be repurposed towards common ends. The existing infrastructure is not a capitalist stage to be smashed, but a springboard to launch towards post-capitalism. 6. Given the enslavement of technoscience to capitalist objectives, especially since the late 1970s, we surely do not yet know what a modern technosocial body can do. Who amongst us fully recognizes what untapped potentials await in the technology which has already been developed? Our wager is that the true transformative potentials of much of our technological and scientific research remain unexploited, filled with presently redundant features, or pre-adaptations, that, following a shift beyond the short-sighted capitalist socius, can become decisive. 7. We want to accelerate the process of technological evolution, but what we are arguing for is not techno-utopianism. Never believe that technology will be sufficient to save us. Necessary, yes, but never sufficient without socio-political action. Technology and the social are intimately bound up with one another, and changes in either potentiate and reinforce changes in the other. Whereas the techno-utopians argue for acceleration on the basis that it will automatically overcome social conflict, our position is that technology should be accelerated precisely because it is needed in order to win social conflicts. 8. We believe that any post-capitalism will require post-capitalist planning. The faith placed in the idea that after a revolution, the people will spontaneously constitute a novel socio-economic system that isn't simply a return to capitalism is naive at best and ignorant at worst. To further this, we must develop both a cognitive map of the existing system and a speculative image of the future economic system. 9. To do so, the left must take advantage of every technological and scientific advance made possible by capitalist society. We declare that quantification is not an evil to be eliminated, but a tool to be used in the most effective manner possible. Economic modeling is, simply put, a necessity for making intelligible a complex world. The 2008 financial crisis reveals the risks of blindly accepting mathematical models on faith. Yet, this is a problem of illegitimate authority, not of mathematics itself. The tools to be found in social network analysis, agent-based modeling, big data analytics, and non-equilibrium economic models are necessary cognitive mediators for understanding complex systems like the modern economy. The accelerationist left must become literate in these technical fields. 10. Any transformation of society must involve economic and social experimentation. The Chilean project CyberSyn is emblematic of this experimental attitude, fusing advanced cybernetic technologies with sophisticated economic modeling and a democratic platform instantiated in the technological infrastructure itself. Similar experiments were conducted in 1950s, 1960s Soviet economics as well, employing cybernetics and linear programming in an attempt to overcome the new problems faced by the first communist economy. That both of these were ultimately unsuccessful can be traced to the political and technological constraints these early cyberneticians operated under. 11. The left must develop socio-technical hegemony, both in the sphere of ideas and in the sphere of material platforms. Platforms are the infrastructure of global society. They establish the basic parameters of what is possible, both behaviorally and ideologically. In this sense, they embody the material transcendental of society. They are what make possible particular sets of actions, relationships, and powers. While much of the current global platform is biased towards capitalist social relations, this is not an inevitable necessity. These material platforms of production, finance, logistics, and consumption can and will be reprogrammed and reformatted towards post-capitalist ends. 12. We do not believe that direct action is sufficient to achieve any of this. The habitual tactics of marching, holding signs, and establishing temporary autonomous zones risk becoming comforting substitutes for effective success. Quote, "At least we have done something," unquote, is the rallying cry of those who privilege self-esteem rather than effective action. The only criterion of a good tactic is whether it enables significant success or not. We must be done with fetishizing particular modes of action. Politics must be treated as a set of dynamic systems, riven with conflict, adaptations and counter-adaptations, and strategic arms races. This means that each individual type of political action becomes blunted and ineffective over time as the other sides adapt. No given mode of political action is historically inviolable. Indeed, over time, there is an increasing need to discard familiar tactics as the forces and entities they are marshaled against learn to defend and counterattack them effectively. It is in part the contemporary left's inability to do so which lies close to the heart of the contemporary malaise. 13. The overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind. The fetishization of openness, horizontality, and inclusion of much of today's, quote, radical left set the stage for ineffectiveness. Secrecy, verticality, and exclusion all have their place as well in effective political action, though not, of course, an exclusive one. 14. Democracy cannot be defined simply by its means, not via voting, discussion, or general assemblies. Real democracy must be defined by its goal, collective self-mastery. This is a project which must align politics with the legacy of the Enlightenment to the extent that it is only through our harnessing our ability to understand ourselves and our world better, our social, technical, economic, psychological world, that we can come to rule ourselves. We need to posit a collectively controlled, legitimate vertical authority in addition to distributed horizontal forms of sociality, to avoid becoming the slaves either of a tyrannical totalitarian centralism or a capricious emergent order beyond our control. The command of the plan, capital P, must be married to the improvised order of the network, capital N. 15. We do not present any particular organization as the ideal means to embody these vectors. What is needed, what has always been needed, is an ecology of organizations, a pluralism of forces, resonating and feeding back on their comparative strengths. Sectarianism is the death knell of the left as much as centralization is, and in this regard, we continue to welcome experimentation with different tactics, even those we disagree with. 16. We have 3 medium-term concrete goals. First, we need to build an intellectual infrastructure. Mimicking the Mont Pelerin society of the neoliberal revolution, this is to be tasked with creating a new ideology, economic and social models, and a vision of the good to replace and surpass the emaciated ideals that rule our world today. This is an infrastructure in the sense of requiring the construction not just of ideas, but institutions and material paths to inculcate, embody, and spread them. 17. We need to construct wide-scale media reform. In spite of the seeming democratization offered by the internet and social media, traditional media outlets remain crucial in the selection and framing of narratives, along with possessing the funds to prosecute investigative journalism. Bringing these bodies as close as possible to popular control is crucial to undoing the current presentation of the state of things. 18. Finally, we need to reconstitute various forms of class power. Such a reconstitution must move beyond the notion that an organically generated global proletariat already exists. Instead, it must seek to knit together a disparate array of partial proletarian identities, often embodied in post-Fordist forms of precarious labor. 19. Groups and individuals are already at work on each of these, but each is on their own insufficient. What is required is all 3 feeding back into one another, with each modifying the contemporary conjunction in such a way that the others become more and more effective. A positive feedback loop of infrastructural, ideological, social, and economic transformation, generating a new complex hegemony, a new post-capitalist techno-social platform. History demonstrates it has always been a broad assemblage of tactics and organizations which has brought about systematic change. These lessons must be learned. 20. To achieve each of these goals on the most practical level, we hold that the accelerationist left must think more seriously about the flows of resources and money required to build an effective new political infrastructure. Beyond the, quote, people power of bodies in the street, we require funding, whether from governments, institutions, think tanks, unions, or individual benefactors. We consider the location and conduction of such funding flows essential to begin reconstructing an ecology of effective accelerationist left organizations. 21. We declare that only a Promethean politics of maximal mastery over society and its environment is capable of either dealing with global problems or achieving victory over capital. This mastery must be distinguished from that of beloved thinkers of the original Enlightenment. The clockwork universe of Laplace, so easily mastered given sufficient information, is long gone from the agenda of serious scientific understanding. But this is not to align ourselves with the tired residue of postmodernity, decrying mastery as proto-fascistic or authority as innately illegitimate. Instead, we propose that the problems besetting our planet and our species oblige us to refurbish mastery in a newly complex guise. Whilst we cannot predict the precise result of our actions, we can determine probabilistically likely ranges of outcomes. What must be coupled to such complex systems analysis is a new form of action, improvisatory and capable of executing a design through a practice which works with the contingencies it discovers only in the course of its acting, in a politics of geosocial artistry and cunning rationality, a form of abductive experimentation that seeks the best means to act in a complex world. 22. We need to revive the argument that was traditionally made for post-capitalism. Not only is capitalism an unjust and perverted system, but it is also a system that holds back progress. Our technological development is being suppressed by capitalism as much as it has been unleashed. Accelerationism is the basic belief that these capacities can and should be let loose by moving beyond the limitations imposed by capitalist society. The movement towards a surpassing of our current constraints must include more than simply a struggle for a more rational global society. We believe it must also include recovering the dreams which transfixed many from the middle of the 19th century until the dawn of the neoliberal era, of the quest of Homo sapiens towards expansion beyond the limitations of the earth and our immediate bodily forms. These visions are today viewed as relics of a more innocent moment. Yet they both diagnose the staggering lack of imagination in our own time and offer the promise of a future that is affectively invigorating as well as intellectually energizing. After all, it is only a post-capitalist society made possible by an accelerationist politics which will ever be capable of delivering on the promissory note of the mid-20th century's space programs, to shift beyond a world of minimal technical upgrades towards all-encompassing change, towards a time of collective self-mastery and the properly alien future that entails and enables, towards a completion of the Enlightenment project of self-criticism and self-mastery rather than its elimination. 23. The choice facing us is severe, either a globalized post-capitalism or a slow fragmentation towards primitivism, perpetual crisis, and planetary ecological collapse. 24. The future needs to be constructed. It has been demolished by neoliberal capitalism and reduced to a cut-price promise of greater inequality, conflict, and chaos. This collapse in the idea of the future is symptomatic of the regressive historical status of our age, rather than, as cynics across the political spectrum would have us believe, a sign of skeptical maturity. What accelerationism pushes towards is a future that is more modern, an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. The future must be cracked open once again, unfastening our horizons towards the universal possibilities of the capital O outside. So that's the end of the audiobook, and I'd like now to comment on what I think was an interesting and relatively exciting, actually, document. I would say that overall, I thought about 2/3 of this was good, fresh, exciting, valuable, useful, and about 1/3 of it was pretty heavily flawed, in my opinion. But that said, it's worth discussing. So let's do that. I'm just going to go through kind of the whole thing quickly and then give some overall summarizing thoughts. So starting with the title, Accelerate, Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics. I think this is a bad title. I don't think that, well, for two reasons. Number one, the term is already in use. Accelerationism tends to be synonymous with immiseration, meaning when people use the term accelerationism, it tends to be the representative of the idea that if you make life worse for the working class, it will speed up, air quotes, the masses waking up. That's what accelerationism tends to mean. Pick a different term. Also, not only is it already in use for something completely unrelated, I don't actually feel like whatever it is they're talking about in this document, I think that they do say some important things. I don't think that the word accelerationism captures the spirit of what it is. And I I can't suggest an alternative word, unfortunately, but I don't think accelerationism is even a good word in the first place that's worth sort of fighting to reclaim it. So for two reasons, I disagree with the title, wish they would come up with something else. Now, these two guys, I did look them up, the authors, and they have written a couple of other things together, including a book that looks like it's about 3 inches thick. I'd be interested in reading more from these guys because this is the kind of, high-tech economic material analysis of the global economy that I think we do need to do. I think that, so getting into part one, where they talk about all of the problems that are coming out, into the 21st century, out of the 20th century. 20th century was an era of unprecedented war, economic explosion, economic competition, and, of course, the wars and imperialism being an extension of that, fight to acquire resources and to dominate labor and exploit greater and greater chunks of the planet and feed it into the capitalism sausage-making machine, and all of the problems that have built up as a result of that. I like how also they point to neoliberalism as being the distinctly kind of new phase that it is. I mean, we had classical liberalism, that was robber baron capitalism. It also resulted in monopolies and such. I think, though, that there's something fundamentally different about what's going on right now since about 1980, as they correctly point out, is that you had a long period of hopeful, optimistic, progressive modernism throughout most of the 20th century. We saw struggles in the early 20th century to end classical liberalism and institute either socialism or, the compromise of social democracy. And then, of course, social democracy, capitalism with a human or social face, if you will, eventually took off that mask in the 70s. That was the neoliberal project, new liberalism, going back to classical liberalism. And we saw it all break down. We went from a time when people had hope and optimism that life would get better from one year to the next, one decade to the next, one generation to the next. And neoliberalism, basically, I picture like a big fat ass, like sitting down and just sort of squashing everything. They say that fascism is the dictatorship of finance capital. It is very much that, the most reactionary elements within the capitalist class decided in the 70s, not coincidentally when the Libertarian Party was developed and started lobbying. They decided, hey, what if we just said, fuck it, let's cancel the future? And that's pretty much exactly what happened. We started getting more of a dystopian sense, not a hopeful, optimistic sense. The very idea of modernism and progress and, some sort of like arc of history bending toward justice and improvement, that came under direct attack, I would say, with postmodernism, which is useful in a few ways, but postmodernism became a political tool of being anti-modernism, which of course is sort of a synonym of anti-Marxism and anti-socialism, anti-communism. Postmodernism, I do think, has some useful concepts, but it did get weaponized as part of an attempt to cancel the future, cancel dreams, abort the entire future that people had been hoping for. We saw the USSR go under about 10 years later, mired in military competition with the USA. This horrible, wasteful system drowned and eventually attacked and dismantled the USSR, reprivatized things. How's that for neoliberalization? Putting things back on the market that had been taken out of the market. So we go through the 90s, it's globalization. The labor movement is, decimated. You don't have global labor unions, but you do have global capital. So capital starts moving its bases all over the place, deindustrialization of the first world. The first world labor unions are left with their thumb up their ass. They don't know what to do, and they're not adjusting. Most of them have been co-opted, defanged, declawed by the liberal establishment anyway by this point. So we get into the 2000s, and we have, I would say, neoliberalism phase 2. The George W. Bush people, Project for the New American Century think tank, decide, hey, why don't we just take over the world militarily? Talking about a dystopia, let's fucking go for it. And they started invading countries. The bottom fell out of the economy in 2008. And then Obama runs on hope and change. Now, here's that modernism again. Here's progress. People voted for Obama overwhelmingly. The Electoral College result was like 2-1, Obama to McCain. And then guess what happened? It was a lie. It was a false promise. And then it's been a long time since Obama. It's been 12 years since all of that. And we're worse off now than we were. We're 40 years into neoliberalism. And, you know, I think that this is spot on. This document, again, it's 7 or 8 years old. And it was written a few years after the global crash, or, you know, a couple of years after Occupy. So let's talk about that. There's a quote in here. I'm going to quote like a somewhat long passage. So, organized labor, being systematically weakened by the changes wrought in the neoliberal project, is sclerotic at an institutional level and at best capable only of mildly mitigating the new structural adjustments, but with no systematic approach to building a new economy or the structural solidarity to push such changes through. For now, labor remains relatively impotent. The new social movements which emerged since the end of the Cold War, experiencing a resurgence in the years after 2008, have been similar, and that would be Occupy, etc., and all of the kind of other things around that came back out of the woodwork. Trying to find the left online in the 2000s, forget it. Occupy was when these things started to come back out again. It was very much underground in the 2000s and in the 90s, very much underground. Reduced to really a subculture almost, you know, it was a problem. Have been similarly unable to devise a new political ideological vision. Instead, they expend considerable energy on internal direct democratic process and affective self-valorization over strategic efficacy, and frequently propound a variant of neo-primitivist localism, as if to oppose the abstract violence of globalized capital with the flimsy and ephemeral, quote, authenticity of communal immediacy. That, to me, they really deserve a standing ovation for those last couple of lines, because that so precisely captures the state of the left in the 90s and 2000s and, you know, kind of up to Occupy. Occupy was pretty much, I think, the summation of the state of the left in the 90s and 2000s. I would say that prior to that, 60s, 70s, 80s, it was, you know, kind of the new left and then the new left in decline. Of course, the USSR, you know, in the early 90s, that went kaput. So we had this whole kind of post-socialism. I mean, China and Vietnam and Cuba and Korea and Laos were still there, but the USSR was kind of like the bulwark of like white people actual socialism that the US was primarily concerned about. You just didn't hear as much about China, for example. It was all about the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. That's really what they were afraid of, that catching on. And so, yeah, in the 90s, you get this post-socialism, post-USSR left. Everybody's scrambling. It's bad. And Occupy was that kind of, I think, post-USSR socialism trying to do what it can do. And it did what it could do. Bernie Sanders, you know, co-opted a lot of the Occupy stuff. I think actually arguably for the better. While the Bernie thing wasn't that original, it was able to amplify and clarify the Occupy platform. Of course, he fed that right into the Democratic Party, you know, taking some of this localism and direct democracy over emphasis and adding some of the vertical, you know, strategic closed off part that you do need in, you know, running a confrontation of global capital in its headquarters, the United States. You need some elements of secrecy and strategy. You need it. I've had arguments with people over this. It's crazy that, you know, people think you can just sort of wing it or like it'll spontaneously develop it on its own. This is why I'm not an anarchist, because none of those conversations made the slightest bit of sense to me. So now, actually, this ties in a little self-promotion here. I started the hashtag Revolution 2030, which maybe a handful of people use. But the concept is we're finally getting away from this stuff. We're finally getting back into talking about Marxism again, for real this time. And, you know, that's a promising thing. But I urge you, you know, study that, because I think there was a lot of sort of self-handicapping by the left. I get it, being in especially a pre-internet world, or a slow internet world in the 90s and 2000s. And you've just witnessed the, demoralization that occurs from the collapse of the Soviet Union or the destruction of the Soviet Union. What are you going to do? People did retreat to their local communities, and they did, buy local campaigns, and they did eat local campaigns, and they did, co-ops and things like that. But these things are really minuscule when you compare them to the forces that we're up against, and they're not going to be sufficient. As good as they can feel. And to be honest, I've participated in some of those things, and it felt way better than working a fucking office job. It really did. But at the end of the day, if you're a lifestyle anarchist eating out of a dumpster, you can, take some pride in the fact that you're not feeding the beast directly, but also you're not doing anything to confront the system that is driving you to eat out of a fucking dumpster. Okay? So that's the piece that comes into play, is like you can only kind of run and hide and do that sort of leave me alone libertarianism for so long. At some point, we do need to come together, converge, unify, and have a strategic confrontation with capital in which we actually do some damage to the fucker. So anyway, I liked the way that they summed that up. Continuing, quoting from the end of section 1, quote, "In the absence of a radically new social, political, organizational, and economic vision, the hegemonic powers of the right will continue to be able to push forward their narrow-minded imaginary in the face of any and all evidence." And comment from me, side note here, is that I did read some pretty crazy ideology of like far-right fringe things that were actually very much about this neo-fascist embrace of the irrational. Like, they have a completely insane worldview, but they have so much power and money, they can just push it and have it become reality. There was a thing, leaked quote during the Bush years where one of the Bush advisors was like, "We say what reality is." I mean, that's what we're up against as the left. Well, it's not just the landlord. It's not just the local employer or whatever. I mean, those people suck, and, they need to be confronted and dealt with, a solidarity network or whatever you have going. But the people at the highest levels of power are fucking psychotic, and they're antisocial in the extreme. I mean, they literally kill millions of people to advance their project. So anyway, continuing with the quote, "At best, the left may be able for a time to partially resist some of the worst incursions, but this is to be Canute against an ultimately irresistible tide. To generate a new left global hegemony entails a recovery of lost possible futures, and indeed recovery of the future as such." I like that a lot. That is, again, this reclamation of the concept of progress, the concept of modernism, and that, we can cooperate, work together, and improve our lot collectively, which neoliberalism, I mean, it might as well be like Satan himself, like just trying to smother the global working class with a pillow in our sleep. It's stifling and smothering and snuffing out all of that hope, possibility, light, and life. It's fucking evil. I mean, really, like at a certain level, sociological terms just don't suffice. Economic terms just don't suffice. What they're doing is fucking evil. So, and I'm not saying that in a metaphysical sense. I'm saying it violates every basic mores that any cohesive society holds. And in fact, many of these mores are getting changed to extraordinarily anti-life, anti-human values. And they're disintegrating. They're disintegrating. The stress you feel every day, it's because your society is falling apart. That's why you're feeling it. That's why you feel the constant anxiety, the constant tension, the lack of a stable identity. I mean, all of these things, which are, can be like mental health symptoms, a lot of it is coming from the defragmentation of the social fabric itself. When you can't rely on society at all being there for you, what does that do to a person psychologically? It can create a lot of tension and anger And, it's nothing wrong with therapy. More people should go to therapy. But, you can wind up thinking it's about you when it really isn't. It's about society. Okay. But so getting back to the document, what does this mean, though? To generate a new left global hegemony entails okay, so what does that mean? So they go into section 2, interregnum, on accelerationisms. This section is a lot of kind of philosophical background and some more analysis of neoliberalism. I thought this section was a little bit thin, to be totally honest. And again, it's about, what they mean by accelerationism. And I just, maybe they developed this in later work, but I didn't have a problem with anything that they wrote here. I just, in skimming over it now, nothing really stands out to me per se. So moving on to section 3, Manifest on the Future. This is the final section. I'll start with a quote. We believe the most important division in today's left is between those that hold to a folk politics of localism, direct action, and relentless horizontalism, or commenting, that kind of direct democracy within an organization, relying exclusively, for example, on a consensus process, etc. Some of which is very valuable. But, your ability to rely on that significantly decreases with the size of your organization. Sorry for the mic noise. And on the other hand, quoting again, those that outline what must become called an accelerationist politics, at ease with the modernity of abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology. The former remains content with establishing small and temporary spaces of non-capitalist social relations, eschewing the real problems entailed in facing foes which are intrinsically non-local, abstract, and rooted deep in our everyday infrastructure. So this is what I was talking about. I think that people have been pushed into, through the breakdown of all of these workers' institutions like public universities, labor unions, community organizations, etc., with the breakup of all these things, especially, you can do it decade by decade. One thing that happened in the 90s is a lot of clubs closed down. This was gentrification in the cities and urban renewal. But running a music club or, a coffee shop or something like that, where intellectuals can come together and also just working people can hang out and enjoy themselves. Low rent is key. Let's put it that way. And in the 90s, you saw a major push to specifically kick all these people out and raise the rents. Where did we have to go? Well, the internet was starting, so you could do a little bit of it online, but and now people are trying to do everything online, and it's immensely unsatisfactory and unsatisfying on an emotional and social level. Is that, yes, there is a folk politics. Yes, it is far, far, far weaker and probably unable to confront global capital in the way that it needs to be resisted and confronted and have the tables turned on it. But also, people need to understand we got pushed into this folk politics. Wasn't just an open choice. People got pushed into it by the shrinking and the shrinking and the shrinking of the commons that previously was used for socialization, interaction, and organizing. So we wound up with this folk politics that was little more than a subculture, especially after the demise of the Soviet Union, because it was like all our heroes are dead kind of thing, and we have nowhere to go, nothing to do, etc. And so there was a lot of despair, I think, shaping a lot of the left. And that's not our fault. Okay, we're victims of that. But that said, we do need to turn it around. And it was one thing to go through that time and realize that, shrinking back into these kind of local left politics, it's just not going to cut it. We do need to come back together. So in the interest of time, I'm going to, wrap it up here. I made a few other comments about in this section. There is we do not want to return to Fordism. There are many other social problems and many other oppressions that are not going to magically go away without direct confrontation. They're not just going to come out in the wash when we resolve some of the class contradictions. Sexism, racism, other forms of oppression need to be addressed head on. It's just not going to come out in the wash, like I said. But I will close as I am preparing to wrap up by pointing out what I think is a weakness and part of that third of this document that I thought was lacking. There's a lot here in this section about the left must do this, the left must do that, we must develop, we must initiate, we must create. And I think that this guy's from Canada, went to school in the UK, at least the guy that I could find an article about. So I think it's very West-centric. And granted, it's from 7 or 8 years ago, so, information, I don't know what. But what I'm trying to say is they're speaking from within the West, from within the place that is most mired in this despair, the gloom, the muck of neoliberalism and, neoliberal austerity-based imperialism. Is there somewhere in the world that is already doing some of the things that they're talking about? I submit that yes, and China is that place. And the United States, at the beginning of the War on Terror, announced that they wanted to do a new American century, marked by just rampant remilitarization, brute military force, just a renewal of military-based imperialism. We're 20 years into that now. It's not going so well. It has basically torn the United States apart. Of course, the EU social democracies rely on U.S. imperial might because it's all one system. The stock market is global. Capitalism is a global system. It's not just like U.S. Militarism and imperialism only benefits the U.S. because all of the capitalist countries are linked through their markets. That's how it works. Yes, there may be some restrictions and legal barriers, but basically it is a global system. So the U.S., ruling class has taken this tack of just going like berserk and just trying to fucking kill everybody, basically, that stands in their way. China, on the other hand, is, I think, doing a lot of what they're talking about here, using big data and analytics. They are reinventing e-commerce, and they're coming to absolutely dominate the global economy. They're also, in the last few years, and this is after this document was written, they started the Belt and Road Project, which, guess what? I mean, if they succeed in doing that, not only is going to create, it'll be 100 times what the Marshall Plan ever was to the United States. They are going through Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and even parts of Eastern Europe and even Western Europe. They're building railroads. They're building massive needed infrastructure that can deliver that future, necessary things. And yeah, they're protecting it with some military bases because what the Imperial West would do if it was left undefended. But I think that there is a good chance, more than a chance, China is doing some of this stuff. I think there's a good chance that China, it will not be a new American century, but a new Chinese century. And I think that it will be China that ends up unlocking a lot of this potential because the U.S. and the Imperial West in general has had its thumb on the scale. It's, like I said, has been sitting on and smothering not only its own economy, its own workforce, but South America and, Southeast Asia and all these places. And we've seen rebellions against that with mixed amounts of success. But basically the U.S., what do? Go talk to the IMF. They'll put you in a debt trap. And then if you can't pay your loan, which you probably can't, your government has to do austerity. It's in the lease terms. It's in the loan terms. This is what Vietnam is dealing with. They still have socialist leadership, but after the Soviet Union was destroyed, they didn't have a partner for aid who could help them in the way that they needed, and they had to turn to the IMF. That's extraordinarily unfortunate. They were able to retain their socialist leadership, but with a lot of strings attached from the IMF, the World Bank. So what I see going on with China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I am optimistic that by laying literally that groundwork and that infrastructure, China is going to build literal escape routes for the developing world to get out of those debt traps, find new, more cooperative, far less exploitative trading partners that will actually help them develop with flexible loans that get forgiven if you can't pay them back and things like that China is doing right now. The West absolutely cannot compete with that. And, it may be this that sincerely turns the tide. I think far too few people on the Western left are supporting China. I think there is a lot of reason to be optimistic about what they're doing, because giving people giving the leaders of developing countries an alternative to dealing with the West, I think that's going to be a huge, huge step in cutting off the first world from its supply of resources, labor, and raw materials that it has been exploiting at gunpoint, and probably the beginning of creating a coalition that can effectively stand up to the U.S. and the West in a way that the USSR struggled to do. And people might say, oh, well, why isn't China, doing more armed revolutions? Well, because they're pursuing this strategy, and you can't really do both at the same time. If they went for direct military confrontation with the USA, that would complicate things dramatically. So it seems to me that that's the approach they're taking. So as far as all of the stuff that they're suggesting, I think China is doing a lot of this now. And, for those of us in the West, the first world, air quotes, I think we're going to see our countries fall apart, and it will not be a pretty scene while we do see the rise of the third and, air quotes, second world in a new alliance. It will starve the first world in a way that will put tremendous pressure. We're already seeing it. Put tremendous pressure on the capitalist class, and they will just keep indicting themselves. They will, they're doing it now. All they offer us is austerity. All they offer us is a dead future. And already people are getting sicker and sicker by the minute of it. The COVID-19 pandemic is a trigger event that is unleashing lots and lots of potential for change. We just saw uprisings and riots explode across the U.S. last year. I have no doubt more of that's coming. So anyway, I think that the only thing, like I said here in conclusion, is the left needing to do all these things. I think the left is already doing it. It's just not the first world left that's doing it. And I think the first world left really needs to orient a lot of our efforts more towards what is going on in the existing socialist world, and that includes China. I'm going to wrap it up here. What did you think? Leave a comment below. This is a very interesting document, and thank you for the suggestion. We're going to leave it there. And that's the video. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen or just support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/socialism for all and sign up for a monthly donation. You can also follow us at facebook.com/socialism, the number 4 all. Used to have a page at FOR all, and it got throttled to death by Zuck. Here on YouTube, please click the like button, subscribe button, and the notifications bell. Please leave a comment if you can, and please share our video wherever you're online, your Twitter feed, your Discord servers, Reddit subs, etc. All of that helps more people to see this content, whether it's in the YouTube algorithm or just posting it on other sites. All of that's helpful. All of you out there supporting and promoting this content makes it all go that much more smoothly. We need to end capitalism, normalize talking about socialism today, and it's really kind of our only hope for a better tomorrow. Thanks for all you do, and we will catch you in the next video.